AVX 512 is a controversial instruction set. Linus Torvalds of Linux fame once wrote, "I hope it dies a painful death." Whenever it's brought up online, people just can't stop talking about how bad the power draw is, how you should just write code on the GPU instead, and how glad they are that their current machine doesn't support AVX 512. And the power efficiency, the power efficiency, the power efficiency. People can't stop talking about it. Instead of explaining why I think these people are wrong, I'll first show you, then explain afterwards. Let's start by comparing performance with and without AVX 512 in the PlayStation 3 emulator RPCS3. On the left, running with AVX2, you need around 62 to 64 watts to run this game at around 310 frames per second. On the right, running with AVX 512, you need around 2 watts less to run at the same frame rate, making the AVX 512 code around 3% more power efficient. In this scene, the AVX 512 path is actually using around 3% more power. However, it's doing this while achieving 25% higher frame rates than the AVX2 path, making it much more power efficient than the AVX2 path. In Dark Souls, we see a similar pattern. With a locked frame rate, the AVX 512 path provides the same performance with less power, and with an unlocked frame rate, the AVX 512 path provides a much higher frame rate with a marginal increase in power draw. Oh, but I'm using the 7800X3D, a Zen 4 based desktop chip, which has the famous double pumped AVX 512 execution. In other words, it splits 512-bit wide instruction execution over 2 cycles. AMD even cutely marketed this disability as a power-efficient implementation. Okay, yeah, but despite popular belief, AVX 512 is power-efficient on Intel chips as well. Here's Ninja Gaiden again, but running on my Intel Tiger Lake laptop. It's limited to around 15 watts, but still provides a healthy performance boost at this low power limit. Unlike my Zen 4 based desktop chip, the Tiger Lake laptop executes 512-bit wide instructions over a single cycle. Now, I know what you're thinking, but what cookie? RPCS3 uses 128-bit wide AVX 512 instructions. That's why it's power efficient. You yourself wrote so in your blog and in your earlier videos. Look, we'll get to that later, but let's first look at the efficiency of programs that extensively use 512-bit wide instructions. This is a benchmark from the developers of David, a decoder for the AV1 video codec. When running with uncapped frame rate, David can decode faster with wider instruction sets. But that doesn't tend to be how people actually watch video. When we look at power usage with a fixed frame rate, you can see that it's pulling less power to achieve full speed playback. At a fixed frame rate, they're actually seeing even greater power efficiency gains than RPCS3 did. David is full of some of the smartest assembly out there, and it's all wide, so the excuse that RPCS3 is efficient because it avoids wide instructions in some cases doesn't really hold water. Now, I don't have access to a Zen 5 machine to run my own benchmarks on, but Phoronix did a lot of benchmarks on Zen 5, which is an interesting data point since the Zen 5 AVX 512 execution units are twice as wide as they are on Zen 4. Now, this is especially fun since AMD was marketing the Zen 4 implementation as power efficient earlier, but across the 90 benchmarks used by Phoronix, they found that Zen 5 was 56% faster with AVX 512 enabled, and Zen 4 was 41% faster. This is without increasing power draw at all, too. So, if every program that uses AVX 512 finds it to be much faster and much more power efficient, where does this misconception come from? Let's start by discussing the first server CPU to support AVX 512, Skylake X. Skylake might be the most prolific consumer CPU of all time. Released in 2015, it would serve as the basis for all of Intel's server and desktop CPUs up until 2021. Normally, Intel releases a new CPU architecture every year, but since Intel's manufacturing division was having problems with yields of the next generation 10nm node, on which all future CPUs were designed on, the lifetime of Skylake was extended significantly. On the consumer side, there were 5 generations of CPUs which all used the Skylake microarchitecture. Each generation provided some improvement, clock speeds, core count, but fundamentally, the DNA of the CPU was the same. Skylake X was another branch of the Skylake architecture, designed for servers and workstations. On top of supporting higher core counts, Skylake X included support for AVX 512. However, AVX 512 wasn't always meant to be a differentiating feature. In the case of compilers, they will update compilers to detect their new hardware, and inform the compiler with what instruction sets the hardware supports, such that compilers can properly support brand new hardware, even if you're using a version of the compiler from 6 months ago. However, with the launch of Skylake, this backfired on Intel. Since Intel originally intended to support AVX 512 on the client Skylake, they sent out patches to LLVM and GCC, telling them to omit AVX 512 when compiling for Skylake. But the actual Skylake product we received was missing AVX 512. What happened? If we compare die shots between Skylake and Skylake X, there's 2 things that are worth paying attention to. This area out here is where the fused multiply add unit sits on Skylake. On Skylake X, the units are twice as long, so it has double the throughput. It's fine to omit this feature on client CPUs since most wide AVX 512 codes on client are going to be looking to accelerate integer code and not floating point math. Over here is where things get interesting though. There's blank space on the client Skylake die, but on Skylake X the area is actually used. On Skylake X, this space makes up the upper 256 bits of the 512-bit register space. Skylake didn't drop AVX512 to save on die space, for performance reasons or for any other concerns people usually give about it. They simply just didn't have enough time to finish the implementation. Now, Intel intended to solve this with their next generation client CPUs, but since Intel's 10nm was so problematic, they had to re-release Skylake over and over again to remain relevant. Intel had the die space for AVX512 reserved, and they put out desktop chips for 6 years with the space reserved but unused. An absolutely tragic start to the life of AVX512. Skylake X had a shorter lifetime than the desktop and laptop Skylake variants, but it was still Intel's flagship design from between 2017 to 2021. Now, Skylake X was launched at an interesting time. In 2017, Intel commanded a massive 98% of the server CPU market share. Intel, of course, wasn't satisfied. They still wanted more. But with no more market share left to gain, they would need to find other ways to increase profits. Increasingly, Intel felt a need to compete with themselves. Market segmentation isn't inherently a bad thing. After all, each CPU is a physical thing, manufactured in a process that's prone to errors. After being manufactured, companies like Intel test their chips to figure out what specific SKU they'll sell the CPU as. For instance, if 2 cores have a fatal flaw, but the rest of the machine is fine, they'll sell the chip with 2 fewer cores enabled, at a cheaper price point. That's much better than throwing the entire thing away, and besides, not all users need an expensive machine with 8 or more cores on it. Myself, I quite enjoy cheap laptops with only a handful of cores, plenty enough to browse the web or write things on. However, not all segmentation is based on physical flaws. There is a variance in what kind of clock speeds each chip can achieve. The highest clocking ones are often sold at an extra premium. Starting in 2010 with the Sandy Bridge line of CPUs, Intel started releasing variants with K in the name, indicating that this particular chip supports overclocking. This is an artificial form of segmentation. There's nothing preventing you from overclocking the non-K chips, except for Intel themselves. For a moment, Intel tried to take this even further by releasing DLC for their CPUs. Yeah, there was actually a moment when Intel wanted you to spend $20 to speed up your laptop by a whopping 200 MHz. That means that all the chips they sold you were already manufactured well enough to hit those boosted clock speeds, but Intel wanted to artificially segment their products in the perfect way to sell you CPU DLC. Oh yeah, and while consumer backlash was enough to make them drop the idea for laptops and desktops, they actually still sell unlock codes to unlock special features on their server CPUs. Seriously. Intel didn't just stop there. They also launched Sandy Bridge chips branded under the Celeron and Pentium line. While these chips featured cut-down core counts and clock speeds as expected, they also did not feature new instruction sets past the introduction of AVX, which is a major problem for any developers who want to drop support for older instruction sets. You might assume that you can drop support for anything pre-AVX, since it was introduced with Sandy Bridge in 2010, but Intel were releasing Celeron and Pentium chips without AVX as recently as 2020. Now, that's all nice, but I think what I just described is mostly okay. Like anyone else, I'd rather have fully featured chips sold to me rather than chips with features and speeds artificially segmented. But what Intel attempted to do with their Skylake X Xeon chips damaged the reputation of AVX512 forever. In 2017, Cloudflare, known for their DDoS protection services, released this blog comparing Intel's previous generation server CPUs, known as Broadwell, to the brand new Skylake X machines. Oh yeah, and they also compared the performance of these Intel systems to some ARM-based machines too. Now the ARM-based CPU did pretty well, but the performance of the Skylake machine was interesting enough to warrant yet another blog post, published just 2 days later. This article was titled, "The Dangers of Intel's Frequency Scaling." The Achilles heel of Skylake X had come to light. While Skylake X featured much higher throughput through the use of AVX512 instructions, it wasn't possible to maintain the same kind of clock speeds that can be reached when executing simpler instructions. Cloudflare was testing with the Xeon Silver 4116 CPUs. They tested a synthetic workload encrypted with the CHA-CHA-20 Poly 1305 algorithm. The in-development version of OpenSSL they used featured an implementation which uses AVX512 and reached a throughput of 2.89 GB per second on a single core. They also tested against the Boring SSL library, which featured an AVX2 implementation that reaches 1.6 GB per second. Now, the author had a theory here. On previous generation chips, executing AVX2 code would drop clock speeds. So, with the brand new Skylake X and AVX512, how much would the clock speeds drop? Well, the clocks dropped a lot. They dropped so much, in fact, that using OpenSSL in a synthetic web server workload resulted in a 10% performance drop over the test case with Boring SSL. Remember that OpenSSL is 80% faster than boring SSL. The problem is that executing a little bit of AVX 512 would drop clock speeds and slow down all the surrounding non-AVX 512 code. Just how bad is it then? Luckily, Wikichip documents a lot of the frequency tables used by these Skylake X chips. And as you can see, on the Xeon Silver that Cloudflare tested with, AVX2 results in a 100 MHz drop, while using AVX 512 results in a massive 1200 MHz drop. What in the world is going on here? Let's look at the frequency table for the much more expensive Xeon Platinum 8160F. On this machine we have the same 100 MHz drop for AVX2, and only a 200 MHz drop for AVX 512. Remember what I was saying about artificial segmentation? The situation is even more dire if you look at one of the Xeon Bronze CPUs. This poor machine has been capped to just 800 MHz if you use AVX 512 code. That's the lowest possible supported clock speed on Skylake CPUs. It literally can't run any slower. Obviously, the Xeon Platinum machines have the most cores enabled and the highest clock speeds. Intel is charging a premium for their best silicon. But you really need to ask what in the world went through the minds of Intel's marketing when they artificially capped the clock speeds of the Xeon Bronze and Silver models so low. Don't get me wrong, the Xeon Platinum behavior around AVX 512 clocks isn't excellent. It's still pretty bad compared to every other future machine that supports AVX 512 from both Intel and AMD. Now, these frequency tables are actually a little misleading. It's actually possible to use AVX2 instructions without hitting any sort of downclocking, provided that you're using simpler instructions that don't take a lot of power. Similarly, if you use simple AVX 512 instructions, you can hit the same clock speeds that complex AVX2 instructions hit. Now, in general this means that integer instructions won't hit a lot of downclocking, while floating point instructions will. But nothing can ever just be simple, and integer multiplication is also heavy enough to trigger AVX2 or AVX 512 downclocking on Skylake X. Actually, the author of the Cloudflare blog post was observant enough to notice this behavior as well, noting that boring SSL doesn't use AVX2 multiplication, which means that boring SSL can actually hit full clock speeds while using AVX2, while the OpenSSL code will trigger the AVX2 clocks. How come? Well, integer multiplication is actually part of the floating point units. We can tell because there are many Intel CPUs that don't have a second AVX 512 fuse multiply add unit. The machines which lack this unit also have half the integer multiplication throughput as well, despite having identical throughput for the majority of integer operations. This is because integer multiplication is part of executing a floating point multiply. There's even an AVX 512 instruction which directly exposes the entire capability of the FMA unit's ability to multiply, IFMA. This instruction operates with 52-bit integers, the same number of bits in a double precision floats mantissa. Now, while I think this downclocking is somewhat overblown, as most consumer uses of AVX 512 are integer-based, like for instance, hashing, cryptography, video, image and audio encoding and decoding, and so on. But sometimes these instructions just end up counting as heavy for inexplicable reasons. VPLZ count is unambiguously an integer instruction, but because counting leading zeros is a portion of what occurs under the hood when executing a fuse multiply add, the leading zero count execution hardware is tied to the fuse multiply add unit. And executing a leading zero count ends up counting as a heavy instruction as a result. As far as I know, which instructions count as heavy or not isn't documented. Good luck! Now, it's important to note that all of this downclocking knowledge that I just imparted onto you is entirely irrelevant for every single consumer CPU that supports AVX 512. On all subsequent Intel CPUs, executing AVX 512 may still downclock your CPU. However, it's not a binary switch where executing one count leading zero instruction will lock your clocks down to some pathetic value. Instead, power usage and heat dictate how much your machine will downclock. In other words, it's not really worth being concerned about. Executing just a few instructions won't downclock you at all, and if you're executing millions of AVX 512 instructions and downclock 200 MHz as a result, you're still going to end up profitable in terms of performance. Oh, and the AMD CPUs that support AVX 512, the Zen 4 and 5 based machines, also work the same way, so don't be afraid of using AVX 512 instructions on these computers as well. Actually, many projects refuse to use AVX 512 instructions unless they meet Ice Lake or Zen 4 levels of instruction set support, since everything released after Ice Lake or Zen 4 has reasonable AVX 512 frequency scaling. Now, since RPCS3 makes such extensive use of 128 and 256-bit wide AVX 512 instructions, we do have a lot to gain from using AVX 512 on Skylake X, but we love the newer machines even more, of course. Now, people seem to have gotten the idea that RPCS3 doesn't use any wide AVX 512 instructions. I actually might be responsible for some of this though, indirectly at least. Here, this Reddit user is under the impression that RPCS3 doesn't use 512-bit wide AVX 512 instructions. People that say these things often link to articles like this one, from WCCF Tech. This article actually links back to a blog post that I made, and even includes a direct quote from the blog. Actually, there's something weird here. The WCCF Tech article claims a 30% uplift from AVX 512, but the direct quote from my blog, in the very same article, claims a 23% uplift. Now, it's not like this is a huge piece of misinformation, since the uplift from AVX 512 varies from title to title, and there are some games that receive over a 30% uplift, but really, how did this happen? Oh, and since the WCCF Tech article was the first one written on my blog, all subsequent articles simply just reworded the WCCF Tech article, rather than visiting my blog and gleaning information from it themselves. Seriously, every other article on this blog inherits this 30% uplift goof. Come on, guys. Now, if we look at the direct quote in the WCCF Tech article, we can see why so many people are under the impression that RPCS3 doesn't use 512-bit wide AVX 512 instructions. I'm really downplaying the importance of them here. And really, nothing I wrote here is wrong, but it's also missing context of what I wrote earlier in the article. RPCS3 did make use of 512-bit wide instructions at the time, and it makes use of even more today. So why was I so intent on downplaying it? Well, if we go back to the middle of the year in 2022, you'll find that people kept asking why RPCS3 used AVX 512. They would come into Discord, YouTube comment sections, or any other forum where the topic was about RPCS3, and they would ask, why don't you do that on the GPU instead? Isn't it going to be faster if you just avoid AVX 512 instructions? Why do you optimize for an instruction set that only Intel supports? Because of articles like the Cloudflare one we discussed earlier, many people believe that there was no reason why AVX 512 should be faster. Additionally, there were solid rumors that AMD's next generation Zen 4 CPUs would support AVX 512, and people were concerned. Since Zen 4 was rumored to support AVX 512, but not actually widen the execution units to 512 bits, people were worried that AVX 512 might actually slow down execution speed on AMD. And so I set out to quell some of these concerns people had. I avoided trying to explain why AVX 512 was so efficient even at wider widths, as that would require opening a whole other can of worms. But I focused on where RPCS3 gets most of its performance uplift from, the new instructions. I wanted to get across this message of, hey, it doesn't really matter how efficient your CPU is at executing 512-bit wide AVX 512 instructions, since most of the uplift in RPCS3 is from new instructions. Downclocking? Don't worry about it. It takes 2 cycles to execute a 512-bit wide instruction? Hey, don't worry about it. What we have are power efficiency gains and performance wins. And I was successful in getting at least that much across to people, I guess. Oh yeah, and as it turned out, RPCS3's use of AVX 512 wasn't over-optimized for Intel. Mystical, who you might know either as the guy who makes half of the greatest posts on Stack Overflow about low-level details, or as the guy behind YCruncher, had early access to a Zen 4 machine, and posted some performance details of Zen 4's AVX 512 implementation. To make a long story short, there was only one part of RPCS3's code that needed changing. Since Zen 4 is actually faster than Intel at executing vperm2b, we don't need this fancy sequence that emulates vperm2b with 2 instructions. We can just directly use vperm2b. Now this time I really wanted to clear up some more AVX 512 misinformation. Seriously, state-of-the-art AI is trained on Reddit data, so all the comments you guys leave are poisoning AI. No really, Reddit is a publicly traded company and they shared that they're engaged in contracts worth millions of dollars per year to sell AI companies like Google and OpenAI your comments. Let's see what the newly released GPT-5 thinks of AVX 512's power efficiency. Remember, GPT-5 is PhD level intelligence in your pocket. Seriously, look at this graph, look how much intelligences it has. You know, I was gonna show you guys this alphabet chart to make fun of AI instead, but seriously, OpenAI, what even is this? Alright, so ChatGPT is essentially summarizing the findings from the Cloudflare article. It's not wrong that long, heavy, and vectorizable workloads are the most efficient on AVX 512 machines, but unless we're talking about the 8-year-old Skylake X, mixed workloads and short and bursty workloads also end up being very efficient. If we check out the Steam hardware survey, we can see how many people are still using Skylake X versus any other AVX 512 machine. AVX 512F is the foundational extension for AVX 512. Every AVX 512 machine supports this. 17.79% of Steam users have this extension. AVX 512 VNNI is supported on every AVX 512 machine released after Skylake X, and 17.80% of Steam users have this extension. That is to say, the percentage of users still using Skylake X is about 0.01%. Yet the internet discourse around AVX 512 is still haunted by the failures of this machine, and it really wouldn't have been that bad had it not been for Intel's artificial segmentation of clock speeds. Alright ChatGPT, make an analogy about ants being bits in an AVX 512 instruction, where the ants are at the bottom of a discarded McFlurry cup, and the McFlurry cup is an AVX 512 register. That cup is like an AVX 512 register. Big, wide, and able to hold a lot inside. But yeah, even here it just can't stop talking about power efficiency trade-offs. Anyways, if you liked this video, then you might like these other videos where I talk about AVX 512 optimization. Anyways, like and subscribe for more. See ya!